Welcome. In this module, we're going to be looking at the subject of the denominational council. This is another module in our study of polity within the United Church Formation Program. So, the denominational council. Names are funny things sometimes. There can be legal names and commonly used names. And the national body of the United Church of Canada actually goes by two names. Legally, it's called the Denominational Council. The reason for that is that was the term that was employed in the remit to the church that altered the structure from the four-court to the three-council model. And when it came time to draft the changes to the United Church of Canada Act, which is a federal government statute, the lawyers insisted on sticking with the term denominational council. They didn't want to give the government any reason to contest passing the bill. So then the 43rd General Council passed a motion saying that the denominational council could be known in church circles by the more familiar term General Council. So both are accurate. When the Comprehensive Review Task Force did the work that led to the changing from the four-court to the three-council model, there was some strong feeling that the one body really needing the most review was largely ignored, namely the General Council. In the previous structure, it was the General Council that was having the greatest level of difficulty, especially financially. And it is in finances that the typical community of faith has noticed the greatest material change in the new structure. We said in an earlier module that previous to the change in structure, the operations of the General Council were funded through the Mission and Service Fund. Shortfalls in giving to the Mission and Service Fund, in other words, the difference between the required budgeted amount and the amount that were contributed. So those shortfalls were largely topped up by withdrawal from the reserve funds. And the reserve funds are made up of money that the church has gathered in the golden years, shall we say, when there was more coming in than was needed for operations. Those reserve funds were quite substantial, but they've been being eaten into for a couple of decades now. And it was the imminent end of the reserve funds that really pushed the structural change. You see, there is a legal threshold below which the reserve funds cannot drop. Under Ontario corporate law, and the United Church of Canada is incorporated under the laws of the province of Ontario, a certain amount of money must be held in case of the end of the corporation. So that will pay for winding up costs, severance payments, and so on. So while the reserve funds still have money in them, that's not accessible for church needs. Now, prior to the change, from the M&S funds, monies were supplied not only for activities that everyone would regard as clearly missional in nature in Canada and around the world, but also the cost of governance, all staff, various expenditures relating to the running of the national church. And that's always been a disturbing aspect of our life, a form of sleight of hand, sleight of hand that wasn't hidden or denied in any way, but not always evident to the contributors to the Mission and Service Fund. All the money did not go towards mission, except in the very large sense of the mission of the church. That was previously. The current model is financially underpinned by the assessment. The assessment, as you may know, goes directly to the denominational council from communities of faith, and then a portion of the assessment is forwarded to the regions to fund their work. So the funds that go to the region come in two parts: basic operations and mission. And that's not an entirely neat division, because some portions of mission funding can be used for administration, such as the salary costs for regional council staff who are engaged in mission work. And I have no problem with that division. And it's a challenge that also exists in community of faith budgeting sometimes. People want to say, well, I don't want to spend money on administration. But many not for profit organizations, like the church, have a perennial challenge. In order to deliver the programs and projects we are committed to, we generally need some form of administrative structure to make it happen. So a certain amount of money is legitimately put into the administration of programs and providing materials and all of those sorts of things, which, strictly speaking, are not the mission. Now, the litmus test amongst charities has always been the percentage of the donations used for administration. And the smaller that is, the happier the rating organization is. And the United Church usually scores very well. In other words, if you make a donation to the United Church of Canada, far less of the money goes to administrative purposes than in other charities. So, for instance, if there's a crisis someplace else in the world and the United Church of Canada is raising money for flood relief or whatever it is, you can usually get a bigger bang for your donated buck by going through the church than through other very fine organizations like Red Cross or whoever it is, because churches already have the administrative structure in place. Now, the community of faith assessments are based on the amount the congregation raises, excluding contributions to mission and service and capital projects. In other words, all the money you raise for all the reasons that you raise money, except for donations to the mission and service fund and capital projects on, for example, the church building. And the assessment figure is 4.5% of that amount. Now, in most places, this results in a small increase in the monies flowing out. Previously, congregations were assessed money by the presbytery, and this is how that worked. The conference determined how much its budget would be, and then it divided that up proportionately amongst the presbyteries within the conference. The presbyteries took the conference amount, added to it the amount needed for presbytery operations, and then forwarded that figure to the congregations to pay. The result of the assessment process is that the amount paid in assessments is slightly larger than the previous amount that congregations were expected to contribute. I can say it's a smaller amount, but given the financial status of many pastoral charges, which is quite precarious, any increase is significant. Now, how much of an increase that your congregation is faced with will depend on the size of the assessment previously paid to presbytery and conference. So, as I said, the conference assessed the presbyteries for their work. The presbyteries in turn assessed the congregations. The previous model was, in very general terms, based on what congregations spent on themselves. But those numbers could be altered quite dramatically. If the conference or the presbyteries had significant funds available to them from donations and grants and whatever else, congregations could be sheltered from the real costs of those ministries. So the variety of changed responses to that. Generally, it's a small increase. In some places, it's being used as a last straw leading to congregational closure. Math is not my strong suit, but somebody who is better at math suggests the difference amounts to less than $25 per person per year in most cases. And if that's enough to break a church budget, it raises a whole lot of other questions. In more than one congregation, I've heard of invitations to members to redirect their givings from mission and service to local. The logic given is that a portion of mission and service was going to the denominational governance anyway, and so the assessment is just picking that up. Most givers to the mission and service fund are intensely loyal to it, so I doubt that's going to have a lot of traction. What is not debatable is that the United Church of Canada congregations pay less to the national body per capita than either the Anglicans or the Presbyterians. However, the funds paid to the national church do very different things, so comparisons are difficult other than in terms of dollars being transmitted to the national level. So, how does the denominational council, the general council, function, and what are its duties? You may recall from an article from earlier in our exploration of the manual that in recent years the system has been weakened and or eliminated through the national nominations process. That's the connectional reality of the national church, where congregants were part of presbytery committees, staffed conference committees, and national committees were drawn from there. About 15 years ago, we moved from that process to one where there is a national nominations process, in which anyone can be nominated or self-nominated for a national committee role. And that certainly spreads opportunity and responsibility far more widely. It moves out of the church geek group to a wider body of people. But it can create a situation where those who are serving on national committees have no other connections or locations to provide different perspectives or support. In the previous model, people would come to national committee meetings not only with expertise in the topic, but also with a guaranteed grounding in the other courts of the church. So we had the previous model, which was congregation members became part of presbytery, where there were presbytery committees. They staffed conference committees, and conference committees sent people to national committees. Then we brought in the national nominating process, where people could be nominated or self-nominate from anywhere and did not necessarily have a body of knowledge or a location other than that national committee. Now, in that national nomination model, the disconnect was mitigated somewhat by the fact that each conference had two positions on the General Council Executive. In the model since 2019, there is no designated regional representation at the national levels. Members of the General Council Executive are chosen for their skills, not for what part of the church they might represent. And there's also a very disturbing 2023 comment by the General Secretary, the Reverend Michael Blair, to the effect that General Council Executive is more of a board than an executive. It's not entirely clear at the point of this recording just what that means, but boards and executives are very different creatures. However, the General Council Executive still retains the power and the authority of an executive, even though it's functioning like a board. There's confusion there as part of the working out of the shift from 4 courts to 3 councils. In many ways, it is the General Council that has experienced most dramatically the fall off in human and financial resources over the last 3 decades. As a result, there has been an almost constant shuffling, elimination of whole departments and areas of ministry, downsizing of staff from 3 floors of an office tower to 1, the ending of some publications, the elimination of some working groups, and the amalgamation of others, increasingly unwieldy and demanding portfolios. a significant reduction in our commitment to our overseas partners. For example, for the first time in well over 100 years, the United Church has no personnel in the People's Republic of Korea. Methodist and Presbyterian personnel had been in Korea predating Union, and it was one of our largest mission fields and later partners in terms of numbers deployed. Like the term region, the term General Council is used to refer to both the national administrative structure and the meetings, in the General Council's case, held every 3 years, of the denomination's legislative and direction-setting body. Sometimes these are clarified by referring to the General Council office and the General Council meeting. There is also a powerful General Council executive that meets between the full General Council meetings. The reality is, however, that as funds for meetings of volunteers have dwindled, more and more power has flowed into the hands of staff, not necessarily by design, but out of necessity in order to carry on the work. The General Council is the supreme policy-making and oversight body in our church, and for that reason its activities tend to be divided between broad policy discussions and decisions and oversight and exercising accountability for national work. In my experience, we tend to do the oversight side of the equation rather less well than discussing policy. You see, the problem is that by the time a General Council Commissioner reads the accountability report of the working group in the General Council Workbook, by that time they are so far from the action that it's next to know what questions to ask, assuming that there hasn't been some glaring act of foolishness. How do you exercise accountability over something that took place 2.5 years ago? What sorts of questions are you going to ask? So we do a far better job of discussing and directing policy for the national units to implement. Those policy-setting powers are quite sweeping, and the understanding is that those who go to General Council are commissioners rather than representatives. By that I mean commissioners will listen to debate and discussion back home, but they are also supposed to come with minds and hearts that are open to the movement of the Spirit throughout the General Council. And that's very different from lining up representatives of various positions and factions. The new General Council is considerably smaller than the one that preceded it before 2019. It's down to about 260 people. General Council commissioners are commissioners for the full term of the General Council, so that means 3 years. Now, in previous decades, that really didn't mean very much because there was functionally little way of reconvening the General Council. In this post-COVID era, we've learned how we can have meetings of large numbers of people, and so there actually is a developing process for reconvening General Council on an annual basis to deal with certain specific things or to receive reports. We're working our way into what does that mean. There are some limitations to the powers of General Council. First of all, changes to doctrine, worship, membership, and government must be remitted to the regions and, if appropriate, to the pastoral charges. Secondly, no changes to membership can be prescribed other than those that are set down in the New Testament. The freedom of worship will not be interfered with. The freedom of worship will not be interfered with, meaning that the local session or equivalent body has the authority over the shape of worship in the congregation. I invite you to look up in your manual the term remit, and see what is said about how those important decisions are made within the church. So, the General Council focuses on doctrine, worship, membership, governance, property, pastoral relations, and the entrance to paid accountable ministry. General Council is responsible for setting a 3-year budget framework for the church and determining the assessment formula for communities of faith, and then assessing them to meet the requirements of the budget. The General Council has a responsibility for the oversight of regions. It has the power to step in and take over the running of a region if necessary. I've mentioned before that there is a General Council executive. And like the General Council itself, this is considerably smaller than its predecessor, 15 to 17 members down from 45 to 50. Unlike its predecessor, in this form of the General Council Executive, there's no capacity for regional representation. It has the powers of the General Council between the 3-year meetings. It's also the legal administrator of the United Church Pension Plan. Communication is a constant issue in every aspect of society, including the church. Part of the challenge is that most of us have so much information coming at us that sorting out what is key is an issue. On the part of those seeking to communicate information or a message, how does one small stream stand out amongst the fire hose of data with which most people are bombarded regularly? Often the claim, "you didn't communicate with us," is in fact accurately countered by those who say, "but we did, you just didn't notice." The real challenge is that you didn't communicate in a way that I could understand, or in a form that grabbed my attention, and or at a time when I was able to pay attention. Makes communication a real challenge. Now, when the General Council Executive was representative, in other words, when each conference had 2 representatives, there were human beings across the country who were invested in that communication. I'm not saying that it was perfect, because it wasn't. But often when a message is associated with a person, it has more Velcro. When communication is largely reduced to email or to optional webinars, it requires much more energy on the part of the recipient to attend to what's being communicated. And so communications, both from General Council and from the region, depend on a few people who are either overwhelmed, mostly ministry personnel, or not sure of what to pass on or how to pass it on, regional council reps and General Council commissioners. And they are being sent to a body. These communications are being sent to a group of people, the local congregation, that is often overwhelmed by its own problems and simply lacks the emotion and the energy bandwidth to take on anything that is not of immediate concern. What have your experiences been with communication from the region and from the General Council? Have you or your congregation found a way to overcome the communications challenge so that people attend to messages which are important to them or important to their church? So when we think of the General Council office, this is the administrative arm of the church, and it does its work through operational units overseen by senior leaders. The reality is, however, that even in the time between recording this video and you watching it, there's probably been another shakeup. So it's really important to pay attention to the evolution of the General Council office, to pay attention to those General Council notices and so on when they come out, because knowing how our national denomination functions is part of your role as a representative person in the congregation, which is what you become once you are ordained. Thanks very much.